osteopathy through a relative who was being treated very successfully. He was a very eminent man in banking, very respected, and my family thought, well, he must be doing something that's worth looking into, as he was an important man, and no one had ever heard of osteopathy. And when I went to the local library, I discovered that one of the only two colleges in those days in Britain that was teaching osteopathy was only 5 minutes from where I lived, in Hampstead in London, literally down the road. Mm-hmm. So I thought, this is strange, this is very strange, something like this coincidence. So I realized I had to investigate. I went round to the college, it was summertime, and the man who answered the door was the registrar of the college, who lived on the premises, and he suggested I come in and chat to him, which we did for 2.5 hours. It was so interesting to talk to this man, and he became an important teacher in my life. He happened to have been an Alexander teacher who was very interested in osteopathy and naturopathy, and he was the registrar of the college. But he was already in his late 70s, and I was so impressed by his use of his body and his posture and his youthfulness that I felt I must listen to this man. So we talked a lot about natural medicine and osteopathy and the Alexander technique. So I decided to join and try the first year, because it was a very interesting college that allowed you to try the first year and only pay by term, so that if you wanted to leave at any time in the first year, you wouldn't lose all your money. I thought that was very nice. That's how it started. But within a few months I wasn't sure I wanted to stay, because I didn't find the standard of science very high. But for this one man, I was willing to continue learning there. But by the third year, I was beginning to be so fed up with the osteopathy that was being taught there, which was so poor, that I really was ready to leave. And just then, John Wernham decided to teach at the college, coming all the way from Maidstone to London once a week. And I was in the class that he was going to teach in the third year and the fourth year, and watching him work as he demonstrated was so impressive for me that the very first time I watched him work, it looked so beautiful. I couldn't understand what he was doing, but it looked so beautiful, it looked so natural, so easy, so comprehensive, taking the whole body into consideration every time he saw a patient, and managing to look and handle the whole body within 15 to 17 minutes each time. It was just remarkable, without moving quickly, without doing anything in a hurry. And that made me decide to continue at the college and not leave, just because I wanted to continue learning from this man. What he was actually talking about in the lectures I couldn't understand at all. And I would go over the notes over and over, and I still couldn't understand it, because the language was so archaic. But a few things did make sense, and those few things made me continue wanting to read Little John. A few sentences here and there made some sense. And so I continued, and in fact I stayed an extra year voluntarily in the college. Instead of leaving after 4 years with my diploma, I asked if I could stay an extra year, because I did not feel it was right to start working on patients and asking them to pay me, and I still hadn't enough confidence in myself and belief that osteopathy really worked. So I asked to stay an extra year, which they'd never heard of. I just wanted to stay an extra year. They were so surprised and so, well, whatever, that they asked me to only pay half the normal fee for that last year. So I devoted that whole year to carrying on with my studies and practicing and working in the clinic as much as possible. And as soon as I graduated, I asked John Wernham if I could come down and learn from him and work with him, which he agreed. And I quickly understood why, because no one else was willing to stay with him for very long. Within a few weeks, I was the only one left in the clinic as his assistant. And then I began what was a 15-year apprenticeship with him. Very difficult in the beginning. He didn't treat me very well until he realized that I really did want to learn. However, I had already begun studying as many texts in his library as possible, And I quickly came upon his teacher, Edward Hall, as well as Little John's notes. Reading Hall's articles, I realised that this is a man I wanted to get to know a little better. He was still alive, but he was in retirement. I began to write him letters asking if I could come and visit him and ask him questions, because he was a very great fan of and student of Freyat, and I had read Freyat very carefully and understood it as best as I could, and wanted to ask him questions, and I included some questions in my letters, so I slowly made an impression, but he was not willing for a whole year to take any student. He was so fed up with students who only came to learn tricks and didn't want to read and study the theory. So he put me off many times, and then I asked John Wernham if he would write a letter, a personal letter of recommendation, which he did happily, and with that letter Hall changed his mind and agreed to let me come round to study with him on weekends, which I did for about 2 years before he died. The last few months he was too ill, and went to visit him just a few days before he died, and learnt a lot from him. But there were major differences between the way Hall worked and Wernham, but those differences grew less over the years. Both were beginning to work less forcefully. Both were relying more on leverages and less on short lever techniques. And even Hall was dropping a lot of the things that made him famous, possibly because he was getting older as well, but I think because he was going back to his teacher, which was Little John, basically, and working more and more like Little John used to work. And I had a very good example of that when I sent him a patient with irritable bowel syndrome, and he basically did no clicks and tricks, no high velocities at all, working in a very Little John manner to help the woman recover after many years of suffering, actually. Working with John Wernham was increasingly interesting. It took many years for me to notice things. It became very important in learning how to practice technique. One of the most important ways I learned was to be a patient of his, a voluntary patient. Even when I wasn't ill, I let him work on me just to experience the treatments week after week. Because there's always something you can do. No one's perfect, so there's always something I can work on. And it was that way that I chiefly learned the art of osteopathy. And also the significance of even the smallest things done properly in terms of changing symptoms, because obviously I did get injured occasionally, I did a lot of sports, and I was ill occasionally, and I let him always treat me during those periods to feel the effect. And that was always remarkable. When I was badly injured or when I was ill, especially if I was running a temperature, then every treatment and every part of the treatment seemed to produce something very much more powerful than when I was well. The body reacts much more strongly to any afferent input when it is unwell. It is, we say in English, it's primed, like a grenade about to go off. You've taken the pin out of the grenade, it's primed, it's sensitive to any movement, it will explode. And so is the human body if the temperature goes up, or when you're ill, or when you're injured. Only a small amount of contact is enough to produce a reaction. And that was fascinating, to be ill and to be treated at the time when you're ill. I learned a lot about osteopathy and the power of just the movements that we do done properly when I was ill.
What is that you would recommend to new graduates of osteopathy? Or?
I would recommend being very, very patient with oneself. Not to get upset or angry if things don't come quickly, if it's difficult in the beginning. It's difficult for all of us. And it can take years sometimes to get good at certain techniques. It can take years to get better at doing things without hurting the patient. But one of the best things to help you is to imagine you are the patient when you're doing what you're doing. Imagine that if you were the patient, would you like to be treated with those kinds of leverages and forces or not? And that helps tremendously. Even to this day, that's part of my mind, partly in my mind when I'm treating a sick patient or the patient is in great pain. What would I find acceptable if I was in that situation? What would be comfortable for me? And that's usually quite accurate. If I was an old lady or an old man with that illness or that injury, what would I find acceptable? But don't expect to be good at anything for quite a while. It's like learning the piano or the violin. It's exactly the same. There's no difference. It's a long struggle, full of excitement, full of tears at times, full of disappointment, full of frustration. Occasionally something happens that's good, and the sound is good, and oh, that's okay, let's try that a little more. Gradually become better at what you're doing.
And how do you see osteopathy in the future?
Hanging on by its fingertips in terms of real osteopathy. It's just a thin, thin possibility that it will survive and grow or totally disappear. Because there are only very few people in numbers that are actually working hard to preserve the way the founders of the profession worked and trying to get the same results as those founders got. With sick people and very injured people. Which is the real challenge, because people who are just mildly in pain or not very ill get better anyway, even if you do nothing. Just wait. Just be kind to them. Just smile. Just give them confidence. Just tell them what's wrong with them. That's already 80% of the cure for most people. To know that they're not going to die and that they're going to get better in a few days or a few weeks. Body will overcome most illnesses. Most illnesses are self-limiting. So the really difficult cases are the 20%, let's say, that don't get better by themselves, or only get better partially. And they're the real challenge, and not many people are taking on those cases anymore, or even know how to take on those cases, because they've not studied the way in which one can produce a very powerful immune response in the body, for example. Not just to infection, but to any inflammatory condition.
Maybe. Well, thank you, Mervyn. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to keep going.
Yeah, I hope to live a long time, so
Yes.
hopefully I'll be around to help.
Thank you.
Okay.